This is Decoded, the video engineering podcast by Fora Soft. Episode 10, The History and Geopolitics of Codecs.
You know, usually when you open up your company's cloud hosting bill at the end of the month, or maybe you're just skimming a JIRA ticket from the video engineering team, you expect the technical jargon to be, well, just math.
Right, yeah, like it's just a bunch of dry statistics.
Exactly. You see these little alphanumeric codes scattered everywhere in the logs, H.264, HEVC, AV1. And at first glance, they just look like part numbers for a washing machine or something equally benign.
They definitely feel sterile from the outside.
Right. You naturally assume they represent some quiet, orderly progression of computer science. Just a bunch of brilliant people in a room making things slightly faster each year.
It's just engineers in an academic lab peacefully handing off the baton to the next algorithm in this perfectly logical timeline.
Yeah, but then you actually look into the history of video compression, the history of these codecs, and suddenly you realize that cloud bill you're holding, it is the casualty list of a cutthroat 40-year arms race.
Oh, it absolutely is.
I mean, we're talking about a battlefield involving United Nations telecom branches, the biggest tech giants on Earth, and literal armies of patent lawyers.
It is a phenomenal hidden history. And, it shatters this very common assumption we have in the tech sector, which is that the best technology always wins purely based on its technical merit.
Right, the math doesn't just win on its own.
Exactly. When you dive into the sources we have today, looking at the comprehensive 40-year history of codecs from our source document, 10codechistory.md, the core revelation is that a codec's survival is almost never dictated by math alone.
It's dictated by hardware supply chains, by Byzantine licensing fees, and in some cases by literal geopolitical alliances.
Yeah, the real world gets in the way.
So today, in this deep dive, our mission is to decode the secret history. We're taking that massive source document and figuring out exactly why the video you are streaming right this second is shaped the way it is.
Exactly. We need to look past the acronyms and see the incredibly human, often very messy, and highly litigious forces that decide what actually makes it onto your screen.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the underlying architecture. Because to understand the brutal corporate wars happening today in 2026, you have to understand the skeleton that everyone is fighting over.
Right, the foundation.
And the craziest part of this source document to me was the realization that this architectural skeleton really hasn't changed since the 1980s. There's this generational rule in video codecs.
Okay.
Basically, every 5 to 10 years, a new codec comes out, and it roughly halves the required byte rate for the exact same picture quality.
That really is the heartbeat of the entire digital video industry. Having the data, keeping the quality. And to see where that heartbeat started, we have to go back to what the source refers to as Generation Zero, a codec called H.120 released in 1984.
Wait, if the UN's telecom branch, the ITUT, built H.120 specifically for video conferencing over digital phone lines, how did it just completely fail? I mean, didn't they essentially have a monopoly on global telecommunications infrastructure back then?
They had the infrastructure, sure, but the mathematical approach was flawed for the hardware of the era. H.120 used some basic predictive techniques, but honestly, the picture quality was terrible.
Like, unwatchable.
Pretty much. It couldn't handle motion without becoming a pixelated mess. It failed in the market because it simply didn't work well enough to justify the cost of the hardware required to run it.
Ah, gotcha.
But it was a necessary failure because it paved the way for Generation 1 in 1988, which was H.261.
The grandfather of them all.
It really is. It's the codec from which all subsequent video compression standards descend. And H.261 was successful because it introduced a concept called hybrid block-based coding.
Okay, hybrid block-based coding. What does that actually mean?
So to get a little technical on how this works, it didn't look at the screen as a single image. It took the video frame and chopped it up into 16 by 16 pixel squares, which are called macro blocks.
Right, because calculating motion for an entire high-resolution screen all at once would, fry a 1980s processor.
Precisely. By breaking it into manageable 16 by 16 squares, the algorithm could simply look at the previous frame and ask, did this specific block of pixels move?
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's called predicting motion. So if a car is driving across the screen, the block containing the car's door just shifts a few pixels to the right. The codec doesn't redraw the door.
It just records a simple mathematical vector describing the movement.
Exactly. That plus a tiny bit of mathematical residual data to clean up the edges. Then it runs that residual data through a process called quantization.
And quantization is where the real magic happens, right? Because that's where you're tricking the human eye.
It is. Quantization is essentially a matrix division step that rounds off the high-frequency spatial details, basically the microscopic variations in texture that your brain doesn't actually register when an image is in motion.
So you just delete it.
Yeah. By throwing away that specific data, you compress the file size massively. So that entire pipeline, predict, transform, quantize, and code, is the absolute foundation.
I found it helpful to think of this like an intricate origami packing technique. You have this massive sheet of paper, which is your uncompressed raw video, and you need to fold it down to fit into a tiny envelope, which is your internet bandwidth.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. So the fundamental folding method, that predict, transform, quantize sequence, that's H.261, that hasn't changed in 40 years. Every modern codec you use today is just folding the paper using the exact same principles, but making smaller, more complex, incredibly intricate creases.
That's a perfect analogy. The modern HEVC codec, for example, doesn't rely on those rigid 16 by 16 blocks.
Yeah.
It uses 64 by 64 coding tree units.
Wow, so way bigger blocks.
Bigger, but also they can dynamically splinter into tinier asymmetric pieces on the fly, depending on how complex the texture is. But it's the same origami, just a master-level folder.
And the source document gives this fantastic concrete example using a standard test video known in the engineering world as the foreman clip. Have you seen this?
Oh yeah, classic.
Yeah, it's just a simple, low-resolution video of a guy's face in a hard hat. In 1995, using the MPEG-2 codec, delivering that clip faithfully took about 0.6 megabits per second. But if you take that exact same visual quality and encode it with the brand new AV2 codec released in 2026, it takes just 0.07 megabits per second.
It's staggering when you look at the raw numbers. It's the exact same picture to your eye, but AV2 describes it roughly 8 to 9 times more efficiently.
So the math gets better, the data shrinks. But wait, the data didn't just shrink in a vacuum, right? One of the most compelling arguments in this source material is that video compression needed to shrink at very specific moments in the 1990s and 2000s to fit into very specific physical constraints. We're talking about lasers.
Yes.
Yeah.
For a massive chunk of this 40-year history, the physical medium literally dictated the codec.
If you think about the evolution of physical media, it was entirely driven by the wavelength of the laser reading the disk. The shorter the wavelength of the laser, the narrower the beam.
Right, which meant the microscopic data pits on the surface of the disk could be stamped smaller and packed tighter together.
Exactly. So you start with the CD in 1982. It used an infrared laser, 780 nanometers. It could hold about 700 megabytes. To fit a movie on that, you needed the MPEG-1 codec, which squeezed out basically VHS quality video.
Then the hardware manufacturing evolved. We moved to the DVD in 1996. The laser wavelengths shifted to red, 650 nanometers.
Right.
So by making those bits smaller, suddenly you have 4.7 gigabytes of capacity on the exact same size plastic disc. What fills that new specific space? The Generation 2 codec, MPEG-2, delivering standard definition television.
And then the massive jump to Blu-ray in 2006. A blue-violet laser, just 405 nanometers. Now you have 25 gigabytes of space, which is enough capacity for full high-definition video. And perfectly on cue, Generation 4 arrives to fill it.
H.264.
Yeah. It's this beautiful dance. The physical hardware literally carved out the exact space that the next generation of math needed to fill.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this synergy between technology standards and hardware platforms has always had deep, deep political roots.
Oh, for sure.
Because this concept of regional hardware dictating standard adoption didn't start with digital video. It started with the very first analog broadcast standards war.
I am so glad the source material included the analog wars, because this explains so much about why tech gets fragmented today.
It does. For half a century, before digital codecs even existed, the analog television world was fractured into 3 entirely incompatible color television systems. And those boundary lines were drawn by Cold War geopolitical alignment and fierce domestic industrial policy, not just by who had the best circuit design.
You had NTSC, PLL, and SegCam. NTSC was the standard for the Americas and Japan. And the notes explained exactly why NTSC had such a bad reputation.
Oh, the phase errors.
Yeah, in analog transmission, the phase of the radio wave determines the color hue on your screen. But if that radio wave bounces off a building or a mountain before hitting your antenna, it arrives slightly out of phase.
So the colors just shift.
Yeah, someone's face on TV would suddenly turn green or magenta. It's why engineers always joked that NTSC stood for never twice the same color.
Which is incredibly frustrating for viewers. So Western European engineers watched NTSC struggle with those phase errors, and they developed a system called PIL, which alternated the color phase line by line.
That's so smart.
It really was. If one line shifted to green, the next line would mathematically shift an equal amount toward magenta, and the human eye would just average them out to the correct color. He was brilliant. But then France and the Soviet Union went with a third standard entirely, CCAM, which sent color signals sequentially.
Right, and CCAM was incredibly robust for long-distance transmission over rugged terrain, but it was a total nightmare for television studios to actually edit.
But the underlying point the source makes is that France and the USSR didn't choose CCAM just because of terrain.
No, of course not.
We want to impartially present the history here. And the historical consensus is that they chose it largely to protect their domestic television manufacturer from foreign competition and to align their political spheres. Because if you wanted to send a video across a border in Europe from a PAL country to a CCAM country, you couldn't just plug in a cable.
No, you needed massive, highly expensive hardware converters at the border.
Exactly. It was a divided map drawn by politics and protectionism. And it is the perfect analog preview of the digital fragmentation that we are dealing with right now in 2026.
Which transitions perfectly into the digital era, and specifically the great anomaly of this entire history. The one time the entire globe actually dropped the protectionism and agreed on a single standard. The codec that essentially ate the internet, H.264.
Released in 2003, H.264 was an absolute technical triumph. It was a rare, harmonious joint effort between the telecom side and the consumer electronics side. It doubled the efficiency of MPEG 2.
And it is still absolutely everywhere. The source document notes that even now in 2026, H.264 still holds nearly 80% market usage.
It's wild.
It is. I have to admit, reading that statistic made me pause. We just talked about the halving rule. If every generation cuts the data in half, and we've had generation 5, 5B6, and now 7, we have codecs today that are 50% better, then 30% better than that, then 30% better than that. From a purely financial standpoint, why on earth are you and I and everyone listening still relying heavily on a dinosaur piece of tech from 2003?
Well, that is the trap of what we call the hardware footprint. You see, in 2007, Apple made a monumental engineering decision. They put a dedicated hardware decoding chip for H.264 into the very first iPhone.
Oh, wow.
And once that happened, every other manufacturer realized they had to follow suit to compete on video playback. Every smart TV, every gaming console, every web browser, and every cheap security camera shipped for the next 2 decades had a physical piece of silicon explicitly wired to decode H.264.
Because doing it in software is brutal on the device, right? Like if your phone's general CPU has to crunch the math for 60 frames a second, it's going to get scalding hot, the video will stutter, and your battery will be dead in 40 minutes.
Precisely. Software decoding is computationally exhausting. Hardware decoding is cheap, cool, and highly efficient. And this introduces a critical rule of codecs that we have to understand. Codecs are almost never replaced. They are added alongside the old ones.
So it just piles up.
Yeah. H.264 became the universal baseline of the internet. You might add a shiny new AV1 or AV2 codec for your viewers on brand new flagship phones, but you still absolutely must keep H.264 around for the viewer watching on a 5-year-old smart TV in a hotel room.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because H.264 didn't just survive for 2 decades because of silicon. It survived because of a massive technical subtlety that kind of blew my mind. When the ITU and MPEG publish a standard like H.264, they are only standardizing the decoder.
Yes.
They only dictate how the device unpacks the bit stream. They do not tell the industry how to pack it.
This is a crucial distinction that most people miss. The standard does not tell you how to encode the video. It doesn't tell you how to search for motion or how aggressively to compress a person's face versus, say, the blurry background of a stadium. That logic is entirely up to the encoder software.
It's like a high-stakes baking competition. The H.264 standard is just a photograph of the finished cake and a list of mandatory ingredients. That's it.
Right, the end goal.
Exactly. The encoder, like the famous open-source software project by 264, is the chef. And a master chef can keep an old recipe highly competitive for decades just by getting smarter about how they mix the batter.
And they did this primarily through what are called psychovisual optimizations.
Right. Because the math can only take you so far before you have to start exploiting human biology. How exactly did...
That was Decoded, the video engineering podcast by Fora Soft. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode.